I was standing in line at the pharmacy when a perfectly manicured woman in a Chanel suit stepped right into my personal space and whispered, "You look exactly like the sister I lost 25 years ago." I tried to laugh it off and asked what her sister's name was. She did not blink when she said my name. The bottle of vitamins slipped right out of my hand and shattered on the floor. She did not offer to help me clean it up. Instead, she grabbed my wrist and said, "We are getting a DNA test right now." My name is Naomi, 33 years old, and I am a forensic accountant who thought I had seen every type of fraud imaginable. But nothing prepared me for the scam my own flesh and blood was about to pull. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who thought you were weak. The woman at the pharmacy did not let go of my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone who looked like she had never done a day of manual labor in her life. She introduced herself as Diana. She did not look at me with the tearful joy of a sister finding a long-lost sibling. She looked at me the way an appraiser looks at a piece of property searching for flaws. She dragged me out of the pharmacy line, completely ignoring the cashier calling after us. I should have pulled away. I should have called the police. But for 33 years, I had wondered where I came from. I grew up bouncing between 4 different foster homes in the grittiest parts of Chicago. I never had a baby blanket, a birth certificate with real names on it, or a single photograph of anyone who looked like me. So despite every alarm bell ringing in my head, I let this stranger pull me into the back of a sleek black town car waiting at the curb. The interior smelled of expensive leather and heavy perfume. Diana sat opposite me, her eyes scanning me from head to toe. Her upper lip curled in disgust as she took in my beige, off-the-rack blazer and scuffed, sensible work shoes. "I suppose I cannot blame you for looking so remarkably cheap," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The private investigators told me you grew up in the system. Foster homes, state-funded schools. It shows." I stiffened. As a forensic accountant, I made a comfortable 6-figure salary, tracking down hidden assets and putting corrupt executives behind bars. I bought my clothes with money I earned through endless late nights and grueling exams. I leaned forward and matched her cold stare. "My clothes get the job done," I replied evenly. "And since you apparently hired private investigators to find me, you probably know I am an auditor. So skip the emotional reunion act. What exactly do you want from me?" Diana scoffed, crossing her arms. "You think highly of yourself for a street orphan. Do not flatter yourself, Naomi. This is not a Hallmark movie. This is about tying up loose ends. Our father wants to be absolutely certain before we bring you home to the estate." She instructed the driver to take us to a private concierge medical clinic downtown. There was no waiting room, no forms to fill out. A doctor in a pristine white coat was already waiting for us. The entire process felt less like a medical procedure and more like processing evidence. They swabbed my cheek and took a vial of my blood. Diana had hers drawn as well, though she complained about the needle marking her perfect skin. We waited in a sterile modern lounge for 2 hours. The clinic apparently offered rapid DNA sequencing for clients who could pay 5 figures to skip the line. During those 2 hours, Diana did not ask me a single question about my life. She did not ask if I was married, if I was happy, or what my childhood was like. She spent the entire time scrolling through emails on her phone, occasionally sighing heavily, as if my existence was a massive inconvenience to her Tuesday schedule. I sat there staring at my hands, feeling incredibly foolish. Part of me, the little girl left on the steps of a group home, had always fantasized about this day. I used to dream that a beautiful family would rush through the doors crying, telling me they never stopped looking for me. Sitting across from Diana, watching her tap her perfectly polished nails against her designer phone case, that childhood fantasy died completely. Finally, the doctor returned holding a thick manila folder. He looked between the two of us and handed the file directly to Diana, not me. "The genetic markers are undeniable," he said professionally. "It is a 99.9% match. You are full biological sisters." My heart slammed against my ribs. I felt a sudden overwhelming wave of emotion. I actually stood up thinking maybe, just maybe this was the moment the ice would break. I thought Diana might finally drop the harsh exterior, reach out, and hug the sister she lost 25 years ago. I took a step toward her. Diana did not even look at me. She did not smile. She did not drop a single tear. She coldly snapped the folder shut, pulled out her phone and dialed a number. She brought the phone to her ear, her eyes locked onto mine with a chilling, predatory gleam. "It is a match," she said into the receiver. "Yes. I found the asset. Bring the car around to the back exit. We are taking her to the estate right now." The drive to the estate was suffocatingly quiet. I watched out the tinted window as the city skyline faded into the sprawling manicured suburbs of the ultra-wealthy. We finally pulled up to a massive wrought iron gate that slowly opened to reveal the Kensington estate. It was a sprawling stone mansion that looked more like a medieval fortress than a home. There were no warm lights glowing from the windows and no signs of life on the perfectly cut lawn, just cold, imposing gray stone. When we walked through the towering double doors, my biological parents were waiting in the grand foyer, Richard and Catherine Kensington. After 25 years of being separated from their flesh and blood, you would think there would be tears. You would expect a mother to rush forward and pull her lost child into a desperate embrace. Catherine did not move an inch. She stood tall in a tailored silk dress, with her eyes narrowing as she took me in. Richard stood beside her with his hands clasped firmly behind his back. He looked like a CEO evaluating a mid-level employee for a minor promotion. "Stand up straight, Naomi," Catherine said. Her voice echoed off the marble floors. It was not a greeting, it was a command. She stepped closer and tilted my chin up with two cold fingers examining my face. "Your posture is terrible. And your teeth, well, I suppose state-funded dental care can only do so much. We will have to get those fixed before we introduce you to anyone important." I pulled my chin out of her grasp. "I did not come here for a makeover," I said, keeping my voice steady, despite the adrenaline pumping through my veins. "You people tracked me down. What is this about?" Richard finally spoke. "Let us not be dramatic. We have a lot to discuss and we will do it over dinner. Follow us." They led me into a dining room that belonged in a museum. A mahogany table stretched across the room set with fine china and crystal glasses. Diana took her seat completely unfazed by the bizarre lack of affection from our parents. A moment later, a tall, imposing black man in a flawless designer suit strode into the room. He carried himself with the kind of aggressive confidence you only see in high-powered corporate courtrooms. "Ah, the prodigal sister returns," he said, flashing a brilliant but entirely hollow smile. "I am Jamal, Diana's husband, and the lead legal counsel for Kensington Holdings." He sat down across from me and immediately poured himself a glass of red wine, not offering me any. The household staff materialized from the shadows, placing plates of food in front of us in total silence. I looked down at my plate, feeling completely out of place, but I refused to show them any fear. So Jamal began leaning back in his chair and swirling his wine. "Diana tells me the private investigators found you living in a rather modest apartment complex. She also mentioned your career choice. A forensic accountant. Is that right?" I picked up my fork. "That is right. I work for a major auditing firm." Jamal chuckled. It was a low, mocking sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He looked at Richard and Catherine sharing a private joke. "A forensic accountant. So you basically just sit in a windowless cubicle and count other people's money all day. How utterly depressing for a woman your age. I mean, growing up with nothing in those little foster homes, I suppose it makes perfect sense. You would want to stare at wealth even if it is not yours." The room fell silent, waiting for me to shrink away. They expected the abandoned street kid to crumble under the heavy weight of their elitism. They thought their expensive clothes and massive dining table would intimidate me into submission. But they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I slowly placed my fork back down on the crisp white tablecloth, folding my hands neatly in front of me. I looked directly into his eyes. I do not just count money, Jamal, I said, making sure my voice carried clearly across the quiet room. I track it. I find the money that arrogant, sloppy men try to hide. I trace offshore shell companies, phantom vendors, and illegal wire transfers. It is funny you think my job is depressing. The two Fortune 500 executives I sent to federal prison last week for money laundering probably thought the exact same thing, right up until the FBI kicked their doors in and seized their assets. I smiled pleasantly, picked my fork back up, and took a bite of my dinner. Actually, corporate lawyers are usually my absolute favorite targets, I added casually. They always think they are the smartest guys in the room. They always leave a paper trail. The mocking smile on Jamal's face vanished instantly. The glass of wine in his right hand halted halfway to his mouth. His jaw tightened abruptly, and a sudden flash of genuine, unadulterated panic crossed his eyes. He slowly lowered the crystal glass to the table, the red liquid sloshing over the side. He darted a sharp, terrified look directly at my father, Richard. Richard's face had completely drained of all color. He stared back at Jamal, frozen in place. The silence in the dining room stretched on thick and suffocating. Catherine cleared her throat loudly, breaking the spell. She waved a perfectly manicured hand at the unseen household staff lingering in the shadows of the massive room. Clear the plates, she ordered sharply. We will skip dessert tonight. We have much more important family matters to finalize. Richard regained his composure, although his face remained a shade too pale. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. He slid it across the polished mahogany table toward me and placed a heavy gold fountain pen right beside it. Naomi Richard began forcing a tight paternal smile that absolutely did not reach his cold eyes. We know this has been an overwhelming day for you. But we want to make things right. We want to officially welcome you back into the Kensington family. This folder simply contains the standard paperwork to add you to the family registry. Jamal leaned forward quickly, recovering his arrogant posture. It is just basic administrative housekeeping, Jamal added smoothly. It also sets up a very generous monthly allowance for you. We know you have struggled on a basic salary. This will allow you to quit your job tomorrow and enjoy the lifestyle you were always meant to have. I looked down at the dark leather folder. A generous monthly allowance. To a girl who grew up eating government surplus meals, it sounded like an absolute dream. But to a forensic accountant who spent her days dissecting corporate fraud, it sounded exactly like a trap. I had seen this exact setup before. Wealthy individuals using vague language to strip vulnerable people of their rights. I did not reach for the gold pen. Instead, I opened the folder and began scanning the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. Catherine let out a loud, exasperated sigh, tapping her nails against the table. Do not be difficult, Naomi. Just sign on the dotted line so we can move forward. It is just standard boilerplate language. We went through a lot of trouble to have our legal team draft this up for you. I read boilerplate language for a living. Catherine, I replied, not looking up from the crisp white pages. My eyes flew across the text, picking apart the clauses hidden beneath the flowery legal speak. Years of tracking financial crimes made these trapdoors light up like neon signs. Section 4, Paragraph 2. A complete and irrevocable transfer of fiduciary rights. Section 7. Full authorization to manage, liquidate, or transfer any and all assets, trusts, and properties in my name, both current and future. Section 9. The delegation of total medical and legal proxy. This was not a family registry. This was a financial execution. I flipped to the final page, my blood running completely cold. The designated proxy was not my father. The person granted absolute control over my life was Jamal. I slowly closed the folder, aligning the edges perfectly before pushing it back across the table. I looked right at Jamal, who was watching me with the intensity of a starving predator. This is a total power of attorney. I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. This document hands over full control of my finances, my legal rights, and any future inheritances directly to you, Jamal. It effectively strips me of my autonomy and makes me your legal ward." Diana scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes. "Oh, stop being so dramatic. Jamal manages all the family assets. It is how wealthy families operate to avoid heavy taxes. You would not understand, because you grew up poor. You should be grateful we are even offering to take care of you." I turned my gaze to my sister, feeling nothing but pity for her ignorance. "I understand perfectly, Diana. I understand that if I sign this, Jamal could drain my bank accounts, sell anything I own, and commit me to a psychiatric facility if he deemed me unfit. I also understand that no wealthy family aggressively tracks down a forgotten foster kid after 25 years, just to give her a massive allowance. You need my signature for something incredibly big." Richard stood up from his chair, his face flushing a deep angry red. "How dare you speak to us with such disrespect after we graciously opened our home to you? We are your family." "You opened a trap," I shot back, standing up as well. I grabbed my purse from the back of the heavy wooden chair. "I am not signing anything. I am a licensed auditor, and I know a fraudulent predatory contract when I see one. I am leaving." I turned to walk away, but a loud, violent crash made me freeze in my tracks. Jamal had slammed his heavy fist down on the mahogany table with terrifying force. The crystal wine glasses rattled violently. One of them tipped over, spilling dark red wine across the pristine white tablecloth. It looked exactly like blood spreading across the fabric. He stood up, towering over the table. The slick, sophisticated corporate lawyer facade was completely gone. In its place was a man cornered, desperate, and extremely dangerous. He pointed a long, threatening finger directly at my face. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," Jamal sneered, his voice dropping to a menacing guttural growl that echoed through the massive room. "You do not walk away from this table. Uncooperative strays do not last long in this neighborhood." I did not wait for them to recover from my jab. I turned on my heel and marched straight out of the dining room. I expected someone to stop me, but instead, a heavy-set security guard in a dark suit materialized from the shadows of the foyer. He did not say a word. He simply gestured toward the grand staircase and followed me up step by step. He escorted me down a long, dimly lit corridor and pointed toward a set of double mahogany doors. The moment I stepped inside, the heavy doors clicked shut behind me. I heard the unmistakable sound of a deadbolt locking from the outside. I was a prisoner in the house of my own blood. The guest room was lavish but suffocatingly opulent. Heavy velvet curtains blocked out the moonlight, and the air smelled faintly of dust and expensive potpourri. I paced the floor for hours. My mind raced through the implications of that fraudulent contract. They needed me to sign away my rights. But why? The family was supposedly worth billions. Why would they need to trap a foster kid they had not seen in 2.5 decades? By midnight, my throat was parched, and the silence of the massive house was deafening. I needed water, but more importantly, I needed answers. I examined the antique lock on the door. It was an old-fashioned mechanism. Growing up in the foster system, you learn a few unconventional survival skills. I pulled a sturdy metal hairpin from my hair and slid it into the keyhole. A few seconds of careful maneuvering, applying just the right amount of pressure, and the lock gave way with a soft, satisfying click. I slipped out into the cavernous hallway. The mansion was completely dark, except for a faint sliver of light spilling from beneath a door at the far end of the first floor. I crept down the sweeping staircase, making sure to step on the extreme edges of the carpeted stairs to avoid making the old wood creak. As I approached the glowing sliver of light, I recognized the hushed, frantic voices of Jamal and my sister Diana coming from inside the study. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall and edged closer to the slightly ajar door. "You lost your temper, Jamal," I heard Diana hiss. Her voice was sharp and trembling with panic. "You were supposed to play the welcoming brother-in-law, not threaten her like some mobster. She is a forensic auditor, for God's sake. Now she is suspicious. She practically read the legal trap right in front of our faces, Jamal snapped back. I heard his heavy footsteps pacing angrily across the carpet. I told your father this was a stupid plan. We should have forged the death certificate 10 years ago and been done with it. We tried that, Diana fired back defensively. You know we tried, but the lawyers grandfather hired are like bloodhounds. They demanded absolute proof, a body or a verified DNA match. Grandfather hated my father. He knew my father was bleeding the family company dry. That is why the old man put the remaining $80 million into an ironclad trust fund. He specifically wrote the stipulations to bypass us completely. The $80 million only unlocks if the missing sister is found and claims it. Jamal interrupted, his voice dripping with venom. Or if she is found and legally signs her fiduciary rights away to the proxy. To me, it is $80 million, Diana. 80 million in clean, untraceable cash just sitting there while our empire is crumbling around us. I held my breath, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. $80 million. That was my inheritance. The money my grandfather had deliberately hidden away from their greedy hands, hoping one day I would be found. And now my own family was trying to steal it before I even knew it existed. Listen to me very carefully. Diana Jamal's voice dropped to a terrifying, deadly whisper. The shell companies are collapsing. The real estate market dried up, and the money we borrowed from the wrong people is gone. We are out of time. If she does not sign that document by Friday, the cartel is going to seize our properties. They are not going to send corporate lawyers, Diana. They are going to send hitmen. We will lose the house, the accounts, and our lives. But she refused to sign. Diana cried out, her voice cracking with genuine desperation. She knows what a power of attorney is. What are we going to do? Then we do not give her a choice, Jamal replied coldly. If she will not give up the 80 million willingly, I will have her declared mentally incompetent. We have the medical contacts. We will say her time in the foster system shattered her mind. By tomorrow night, your sister will either be a signatory or a psychiatric patient. I slipped back down the dark hallway and into my room before they could hear my racing heartbeat. I gently clicked the deadbolt back into place and sat on the edge of the lavish bed in the dark. My mind was spinning. $80 million. A fraudulent trust fund grab. And a threat to lock me in a psychiatric ward by tomorrow night. I realized then that my only option was to play along. I had to make them believe I was breaking, so I could buy enough time to gather the evidence I needed to destroy them. When the sun rose a few hours later, a sharp knock at my door startled me. The lock clicked open from the outside and Catherine breezed into the room. She was wearing a pristine white tennis outfit and a bright, sunny smile that completely erased the cold venom from the night before. "Good morning, Naomi," she said cheerfully, setting a silver tray with coffee and a croissant on the nightstand. "I hope you slept well. We have a wonderful day planned. We are taking you to the country club for a special brunch to introduce you to some of our closest friends." I stared at her in disbelief. There was no mention of the explosive dinner, no mention of Jamal slamming his fist on the table or threatening me. It was textbook gaslighting. She was acting as if the hostility had never happened, hoping my own memories would confuse me. "I brought you something to wear," she continued, pulling a garment bag from over her arm. "You cannot go to the club in those drab office clothes you arrived in. I want my girls looking perfect." She unzipped the bag and pulled out a dress. I had to force myself not to physically recoil. It was a hideous, oversized floral monstrosity that looked like it belonged in a 1980s thrift store. It had massive, puffy sleeves, a high ruffled collar, and a clashing neon pattern that hurt the eyes. It was not just ugly, it was bizarre. "Put this on," Catherine insisted, her sweet tone layered with a quiet threat. "It will look absolutely precious on you." I knew exactly what she was doing. They needed to build a narrative that I was mentally unstable. If Jamal was going to declare me incompetent, they needed witnesses to see me looking disheveled, eccentric, and completely out of touch with reality. This dress was step one of their smear campaign. I looked at my reflection in the ornate mirror holding the awful fabric against my chest. Growing up in the foster system, I had worn my fair share of terrible hand-me-downs. I had been mocked in school for wearing shoes that were 2 sizes too big. But there was never any malicious intent behind that poverty. The system was just broken. This family, however, was purely evil. For the first time in my life, I realized my painful, lonely childhood had actually been a blessing. Being raised away from these sociopaths was the only reason my mind had survived intact. I let my shoulders slump. I widened my eyes and gave Catherine a meek, confused smile. "Thank you, Mother," I said softly, making my voice tremble just a little. "It is beautiful." Catherine practically beamed with wicked satisfaction. "Hurry up and get dressed," she commanded, before turning on her heel and leaving the room. An hour later, we walked onto the sun-drenched patio of the elite country club. Diana and Jamal were already seated at a large table surrounded by wealthy socialites and local politicians. Diana looked flawless in a custom silk sundress, while I walked behind Catherine, looking like a deranged clown in the ruffled floral disaster. I could feel the stares burning into my skin. I could hear the hushed whispers and see the wealthy women hiding their smirks behind their crystal mimosa glasses. "Oh, everyone, this is my sister Naomi," Diana announced, her voice dripping with fake pity. "Please excuse her appearance. She is still adjusting to civilized society. She is very fragile right now, so please do not overwhelm her with too many questions." The guest nodded with exaggerated sympathy, treating me like a wounded, confused animal. I kept my head down, playing the part perfectly. I sat rigidly in my chair, staring blankly at my plate, while they chattered around me. But while they thought they were breaking my spirit, they had no idea what my hands were doing under the long white tablecloth. I had my smartphone resting silently on my lap. I connected to my accounting firm's secure encrypted investigative portal using a private virtual network. While Jamal boasted loudly about his latest legal victory over a plate of smoked salmon, I was running a deep background check on his firm. I bypassed the basic public records and dug straight into the corporate tax filings. My fingers flew across the screen. I traced the registered agents listed on his primary accounts. Within minutes, I hit a massive digital wall. Heavily encrypted flagged offshore accounts registered in the Cayman Islands. They were routing massive sums of money through dummy corporations. It was not just bad business or poor estate management. It was high-level organized money laundering, and Jamal was the architect. I slipped my phone back into my cheap purse, just as the waiters arrived to clear our plates. I had the evidence I needed, but I had to keep playing their game. Diana leaned across the table, her eyes locking onto me with a predatory glint. She was sitting next to a man named Harrison, a senior partner at a major investment bank. Harrison had been complaining loudly for the last 20 minutes about a new federal tax regulation that was threatening to eat into his firm's quarterly profits. Diana saw an opening to humiliate me, and she took it without hesitation. "You know Harrison, my little sister Naomi here claims to be an accountant," Diana said, her voice carrying clearly over the clinking glasses and polite chatter. "Of course, she only works for one of those tiny little local agencies, but maybe she could offer you some of her expert advice. What do you think, Naomi? How would you solve Harrison's little capital gains problem?" The entire table went dead silent. The wealthy socialites and powerful men turned to look at me in my hideous puffy dress. They expected me to stutter. They expected me to look down at my lap and mumble an apology. Diana was setting me up to look incompetent and delusional, exactly as Jamal had planned. She wanted them to think I was a pathological liar who made up a fake career to cope with my tragic childhood. I slowly wiped my mouth with my linen napkin and looked directly at Harrison. "The issue you are facing with the new regulation is not about capital gains, Harrison," I said, my voice clear and unwavering. "It is about how your firm is classifying depreciation on your acquired real estate assets." Harrison blinked, his patronizing smile faltering just a bit. "Oh, really?" And how exactly would you know that? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, projecting absolute confidence. Because while you are using the standard straight-line depreciation model, the new tax code actually allows for a cost segregation study on commercial properties acquired after 2018. If you reclassify the interior components of your buildings, you can accelerate the depreciation schedule from 39 years down to 5 years. It creates a massive upfront paper loss that legally offsets your taxable income. You are paying millions in taxes that you do not actually owe simply because your current accounting firm is too lazy to do the manual paperwork. The silence at the table shifted from mocking to absolute shock. Harrison stared at me with his mouth slightly open. He was a man who paid thousands of dollars an hour for financial advice, and I had just handed him a multi-million-dollar loophole over a plate of smoked salmon. Growing up with nothing teaches you the value of every single penny. I continued, turning my gaze to Diana, who was now gripping her mimosa glass so hard her knuckles were white. When I was studying for my licensing exams in my tiny studio apartment living on cheap noodles, I made sure to memorize the tax code inside and out. I worked 3 jobs just to pay for my textbooks. It turns out that state-funded education and relentless hard work gave me a much better grasp of federal law than whatever expensive private school you attended, Diana. Harrison let out a loud booming laugh and slammed his hand on the table. He completely ignored Diana and pointed a finger at me. "That is the most brilliant breakdown of the new code I have heard all month," Harrison declared. "Who did you say you work for again, Naomi? Because if they do not double your salary by Monday, I will hire you myself. My firm could absolutely use someone with your sharp eyes." The other investors at the table nodded in agreement, suddenly looking at me with genuine respect. I was no longer the fragile, tragic sister in the ugly dress. I was the smartest person in the room. Across the patio, I saw Jamal watching me with narrowed eyes, his jaw clenching in silent fury. Diana looked like she was going to be sick. Her plan to humiliate me had backfired spectacularly. I had just proved to a table full of the most influential people in the city that my mind was razor sharp. Jamal's plan to declare me mentally incompetent was going to be much harder to execute now that Harrison and his billionaire friends had witnessed my financial expertise firsthand. "Excuse us," Diana said abruptly, standing up and grabbing her designer clutch. Her voice was shaking with barely contained rage. "Naomi and I need to visit the powder room." She did not wait for my response. She grabbed my arm with bruising force and practically dragged me away from the table. We walked past the wealthy patrons and down a quiet carpeted hallway toward the restrooms. The moment the heavy oak door of the ladies' room swung shut behind us, the polite high society facade vanished completely. Diana shoved me hard against the marble counter. She leaned in so close I could smell the champagne and bitter jealousy radiating off her. Her eyes were wide and frantic. "Listen to me, you little street rat!" Diana hissed, her fingers digging viciously into my arm. "Do not think you are clever. Do not think you can come into my world and embarrass me in front of my friends. You are going to sign that document tomorrow night, and then you are going to disappear. If you ever speak out of turn again, I will personally make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life locked inside a padded cell. Do you understand me?" I looked down at her fingers digging into my arm, and then looked right back into her frantic eyes. I did not flinch. I slowly reached up and peeled her hand off my skin finger by finger. "I understand that you are terrified, Diana," I replied, my voice completely flat. "But you need to learn not to touch me." I turned my back on her and walked out of the restroom, leaving her fuming by the sinks. The rest of the brunch was predictably tense. Harrison tried to engage me in more conversation, but Catherine swiftly intervened, making up an excuse about me needing my afternoon medication. They rushed me back to the waiting town car before I could say another word. The moment we stepped through the heavy front doors of the Kensington estate, Richard and Catherine practically vanished into the West Wing. Diana shot me one last venomous glare before storming upstairs. I was left standing alone in the grand foyer. Or so I thought. Heavy footsteps echoed behind me. Jamal stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, his imposing frame blocking my path to the stairs. His slick, arrogant smile was firmly back in place. My office. Naomi, he demanded, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall. We have some unfinished business to discuss. I knew better than to argue in an empty hallway. I walked past him and stepped into his dimly lit home office. The walls were lined with expensive leather-bound law books, and the air smelled of stale cigars and pure greed. The moment I crossed the threshold, Jamal closed the door behind us and locked the deadbolt with a heavy metallic click. He walked over to his massive mahogany desk and picked up a thick manila folder. He tossed it onto the glass surface. It landed with a heavy thud. Go ahead, he said, leaning against the edge of the desk and crossing his arms. Read it. I stepped forward and opened the folder. The first page had the letterhead of a highly exclusive private psychiatric facility. My eyes quickly scanned the text. It was a comprehensive medical evaluation declaring me a danger to myself and others. It listed symptoms I had never experienced: severe paranoid delusions, grandiose manic episodes, compulsive pathological lying, and violent outbursts. The document was signed by a chief of psychiatry and countersigned by someone else, a name that made my blood run cold. You remember your old social worker, do you not? Jamal asked, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. Mrs. Gable from the Illinois Department of Child Services. She was the one who shuffled you between those 4 miserable foster homes. I stared at the signature. Mrs. Gable had always been a bitter, exhausted woman who barely looked at me when she dropped me off at new houses with nothing but a trash bag for my clothes. It is truly amazing what people will do for a little bit of cash, Naomi, Jamal continued. Mrs. Gable is retired now, living on a modest state pension. When I offered her $100,000 to sign an affidavit swearing that you exhibited severe psychotic behavior throughout your entire childhood, she practically tripped over herself to find a pen. Jamal chuckled darkly, picking up the forged document and waving it in my face. The foster system is a joke. It is full of underpaid bureaucrats who do not care about throwaway kids like you. She was more than happy to backdate these evaluations. According to her official sworn testimony, your trauma from bouncing around the system completely shattered your fragile mind. You created this fantasy world where you are a successful auditor just to cope with your miserable reality. I stared at him, keeping my breathing slow and steady. You know this will not hold up in a real court, I said. Any independent doctor would clear me in 10 minutes. Jamal laughed loudly, shaking his head. You really do not understand how the world works, do you? You are in my world now. In my world, we do not need a real court. I have a private judge on retainer who will sign a mandatory commitment order the second I put this file on his desk. I already have a private medical transport team sitting in an unmarked van exactly 3 blocks from this house. They specialize in handling uncooperative, delusional patients. They will come in here, strap you to a gurney, and pump you so full of sedatives you will not remember your own name, let alone the federal tax code. He stepped closer, towering over me. His eyes were cold and dead, completely devoid of any human empathy. So, here is the deal. Street rat, Jamal said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You are going to sign the trust fund documents releasing the $80 million to me. You are going to do it right now. If you refuse, I make one phone call and those men come through that door. You will be locked inside a padded cell by sundown, and no one in the world will ever come looking for you. The choice is yours. I stared at him, letting my eyes widen in sheer terror. I did not have to try very hard to force my hands to shake. The reality of what he was threatening was genuinely terrifying, but I knew panic would not save me. I had to outsmart him. I let out a choked sob and stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the heavy leather sofa. Please, I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. Please do not call them. I will sign it. I will give you everything. Just please do not lock me away in one of those places. Jamal smiled, a slow, sickeningly triumphant smile. He looked down at me like a god staring at an insect. That is what I thought, he sneered. Sit at the desk and sign the papers, Naomi. Do not make me ask twice. I wrapped my arms around myself, hyperventilating. I stumbled toward the massive mahogany desk, but stopped just short of the gold pen. I cannot just sign it blindly, I sobbed, wiping fake tears from my cheeks. I am an auditor, Jamal. It is wired into my brain. If I do not read it first, I will have a complete mental breakdown. Please, just give me 1 hour. Let me sit here alone and read the contract. I swear I will sign it. Just give me an hour to process that my life is changing. He stared at me, weighing his options. He loved seeing me broken and pathetic. He thrived on the power trip of breaking a stubborn opponent. He smoothed his designer tie and glanced at his gold Rolex. You have exactly 60 minutes, he said, his tone absolute ice. I am locking this door from the outside. If that document is not signed when I return, I make the call to the medical transport team. He turned and walked out of the office. The heavy oak door slammed shut and the deadbolt slid into place with a loud final click. I stood frozen for exactly 5 seconds, listening to his heavy footsteps fade down the carpeted hallway. The moment there was total silence, my tears stopped instantly. My shaking hands steadied. I wiped my face, took a deep breath, and immediately got to work. I opened my cheap purse and pulled out my work laptop. I also pulled out a high-capacity encrypted USB drive I always carried for field audits. Growing up in the foster system, you learn to adapt to your surroundings in seconds. You learn how to survive when the adults in the room are actively trying to destroy you. Jamal thought my background made me weak, but it had actually forged me into someone who never cracked under pressure. I had spent my entire life learning how to be invisible and how to strike when people least expected it. I walked around the mahogany desk and woke up his computer. I bypassed his password-protected screensaver in under 2 minutes, using a standard brute force key drive. Jamal was a brilliant manipulator, but like most arrogant corporate lawyers, he was shockingly careless with his local network security. He assumed the heavy gates of his mansion kept the world out. He never considered the threat was already sitting at his desk. I connected my laptop to his local server port. My forensic accounting software bypassed the basic firewalls and dug deep into the hidden partitions of his hard drive. I was not looking for the fake corporate tax filings he showed the government. I was looking for the shadow ledgers, the raw, unedited data that showed exactly where the cartel money was moving. The screen flooded with lines of code and massive spreadsheets. There it was. Hundreds of wire transfers routed through shell companies in the Bahamas, Panama, and Switzerland. He was laundering millions every single week to cover the family debts. But the debts were growing faster than the illegal income. The Kensington Empire was completely underwater. I saw massive loans secured by properties they no longer even owned. I initiated the download sequence, transferring the entire shadow ledger onto my hidden USB drive. A progress bar appeared on my screen. 10%, 20%. The files were massive, containing decades of financial crimes. My heart hammered against my ribs. I kept my eyes darting between the downloading screen and the locked oak door. 50%, 60%. If Jamal walked in right now, he would not just send me to a psychiatric ward. He would likely kill me to protect his cartel connections. I was stealing the exact leverage he used to stay alive. 80%, 90%. Suddenly I heard heavy footsteps approaching down the hallway. They were moving fast. Jamal was coming back early. He was not going to give me the full hour. 95%, 99%. The progress bar vanished. Download complete. I yanked the USB drive from the port and shoved it deep into my bra. I slammed my laptop shut and shoved it back into my purse, just as I heard the key sliding into the deadbolt lock. I immediately threw myself across the desk, burying my face in my arms. I forced myself to hyperventilate, letting out a loud, pathetic sob. The heavy door swung open and Jamal stepped into the room, finding me weeping helplessly over the unsigned contract. Jamal stood in the doorway looking down at me with absolute contempt. He thought he had completely shattered me. I kept my face buried in my arms, letting my shoulders heave as if I was gasping for air. He walked slowly around the desk and tapped his expensive leather shoe against the leg of my chair. "Are we done playing games, Naomi?" he asked, his voice laced with cruel satisfaction. "Are you ready to sign?" I slowly lifted my head, making sure my eyes were wide and filled with fake desperation. "I will sign it," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I will give you everything. Just please do not send me away." He picked up the gold pen and held it out to me. "Good girl. Sign right here." I reached for the pen, but let my hand shake violently before pulling it back. "Wait," I said, swallowing hard. "Jamal, if I sign this in a locked room right after you threatened me, any decent lawyer could eventually argue I signed it under extreme duress. You know that. The proxy could be contested in court, and your funds would be frozen for years." Jamal narrowed his eyes, the pen still suspended in the air. "What are you suggesting?" I took a ragged breath. "The family gala is on Friday night, right? Hundreds of people will be there. High society investors, politicians, and judges. Let me sign it then, in front of everyone. I will smile and tell the crowd I am handing over the trust fund voluntarily, because I am not equipped to handle that kind of wealth. I will play the part perfectly. You get your money with ironclad legal witnesses, and I get to prove I am sane enough to stay out of a padded cell." Jamal stared at me, weighing the legal strategy. His massive ego loved the idea of a public surrender. Having me hand over $80 million in front of the city elite would solidify his power and eliminate any future legal challenges. "Fine," he said, tossing the pen back onto the desk. "You have 48 hours. Go back to your miserable little apartment, pack your things, and prepare your speech. If you try to run, my men will find you before you even reach the city limits." I nodded meekly, grabbed my cheap purse, and hurried out of the office. I did not look back. I walked straight out the front doors of the estate, past the heavily armed security guards, and got into the town car waiting to take me home. The moment I stepped inside my modest apartment, I locked the deadbolt, closed the blinds, and let out a massive breath. I was safe for now. I walked into my small kitchen, brewed the strongest pot of coffee I had, and sat down at my dining table. I pulled the encrypted USB drive from my bra and plugged it into my personal forensic workstation. The crying act was over. It was time to go to work. For the next 10 hours, I did not move from my chair. I cross-referenced Jamal's shadow ledgers against international banking databases and offshore corporate registries. What I found was absolutely staggering. The Grand Kensington Empire was nothing but a hollow, rotting shell. Richard had made a series of catastrophic real estate investments over the last decade. They were completely broke. Their properties were leveraged to the maximum limit, and their bank accounts were effectively running on fumes. But that was not the worst part. To keep the mansion and the luxury cars, Jamal had made a deal with the devil. He was using the family real estate portfolio to launder massive amounts of cash for a notorious international drug cartel. Millions of dollars were flowing from illicit accounts in Colombia into Kensington Holdings and then being washed clean through fake construction contracts. However, Jamal had gotten greedy. He had started skimming off the top of the cartel money to fund his own lavish lifestyle. The cartel had found out. They were demanding immediate repayment of $40 million, or they were going to start eliminating the family one by one. That was why they needed my $80 million trust fund. They were not just greedy, they were terrified and desperate to buy their lives back. I rubbed my burning eyes, scrolling through the final pages of the ledger. I had enough evidence to put Jamal and Richard in federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. I was about to close the program and call my contacts at the FBI when a strange file path caught my eye. It was located in a deeply archived hidden partition separate from the cartel ledgers. The encryption protocol was outdated, meaning the file had been created decades ago and never touched again. I ran a decryption algorithm, waiting anxiously as the progress bar inched forward. When the folder finally cracked open, my blood ran completely cold. There was only one document inside. It was a scanned bank receipt from a private offshore account. The file was simply labeled 1999 Asset Transfer. 1999. I stared at the screen, my hands beginning to shake for real this time. That was the exact year I went missing. I clicked on the file with a heavy sense of dread. The screen flickered for a fraction of a second before a high-resolution scan of a yellowed banking document appeared. It was a wire transfer authorization form dated October 14th, 1999. The exact day, the 1999. The exact day the police report said I wandered away from a family picnic in the park and vanished without a trace. My eyes scanned the faded ink. The transfer was initiated from a private offshore account solely registered to my father, Richard Kensington. The recipient was a holding company based out of Eastern Europe. The amount transferred was exactly $500,000. My forensic software was still running in the background. I took the routing number from the old receipt and ran it through the modern federal database. It took less than 30 seconds for the system to flash a massive red warning banner across my screen. The holding company was not a real estate firm or an investment group. I remembered holding my mother's hand at the park. I remembered a tall man in a dark coat approaching us. I always thought my mother had just turned her head for a second, and I was snatched away in the blink of an eye. But the memory was clearer now. She did not turn her head by accident. She looked right at the man, let go of my small hand, and walked away without ever looking back. I had spent my entire childhood wondering why my mommy did not hear me crying for her. It was because she was busy securing her wealth. But why? Why would wealthy parents sell their own child? I pulled up the grandfather's original corporate structuring documents from the cartel ledger archive. The answer was right there in black and white. My grandfather despised Richard's reckless spending and Catherine's toxic elitism. But he adored me. The documents showed that just weeks before I disappeared, my grandfather had initiated legal proceedings to bypass Richard entirely and leave the controlling shares of the Kensington Empire directly to me in a heavily protected trust. Richard and Catherine realized they were going to lose their access to the billions. They needed Diana, their easily manipulated golden child, to be the sole undisputed heir. But they could not simply kill me without raising the grandfather's intense suspicions and triggering a massive police investigation. So they paid a professional trafficking ring to make me disappear forever, ensuring the money would flow exactly where they wanted it. They threw their own flesh and blood into the abyss so they could keep buying luxury cars and attending country club brunches. For 25 years I had blamed myself. I thought I was unlovable. I endured abusive foster parents, freezing cold bedrooms, and nights where I cried myself to sleep entirely alone. I had starved while they drank expensive champagne, all because of their unbearable greed. A single tear tracked down my cheek, but I quickly wiped it away. The profound sadness that had weighed on my chest for my entire life suddenly evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a searing, absolute, cold-blooded rage. The scared little foster girl inside of me died in that chair. I was no longer a traumatized victim desperately searching for a family to love her. I was a forensic auditor staring at the biggest fraud of my career, and I was going to burn their entire corrupt world to the ground. I closed the file and picked up my phone. I did not call the local police. The local police were likely on Jamal's payroll. Instead, I pulled up a highly classified contact number from a joint federal task force I had consulted for last year. The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Special Agent Miller," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying calm. "This is Naomi." I had just sat down and opened my email when the heavy glass doors of the office burst open with a loud, violent crash. Diana marched into the room. She was wearing a furious expression and a bright red designer trench coat that practically screamed for attention. She did not bother stopping at the reception desk. She scanned the open floor-locked eyes with me and stomped right over to my cubicle, her expensive heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. Before I could even stand up, she slammed her hands flat on my desk. Her voice was loud enough to carry across the entire floor. "I know what you did, you little thief," Diana screamed. Every single head in the office snapped in our direction. Telephones stopped ringing. The quiet hum of keyboards completely ceased. My coworkers stared in absolute shock. I stood up slowly, keeping my hands visible. "Diana, what are you doing here?" I asked, making sure my voice sounded appropriately shaky and intimidated. "Do not play dumb with me," Diana shrieked, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "Jamal told me you were alone in his office yesterday. He said you were snooping around his private servers. You stole corporate data, did you not? You are trying to steal client lists and financial records to help your pathetic little career." I realized exactly what she was doing. She was projecting. She was trying to build a public narrative of corporate espionage so that if I tried to release the cartel documents later, they could claim I had illegally fabricated or stolen them for my own financial gain. She wanted to destroy my professional credibility right here in front of my peers. I did not steal anything. "Diana," I whispered, shrinking back against my chair. "Please lower your voice. You are embarrassing me in front of my team. Embarrassing you." Diana let out a harsh, cruel laugh that echoed off the glass walls. "You are an embarrassment to our entire family. You have always been a parasite, Naomi. Even when we were kids, you were always trying to take what was mine. You want my life. You want my money. You want my husband to respect you. You are nothing but a jealous street rat pretending to be a professional." Her words were meant to cut deep, revealing the core of her deep-seated jealousy. She knew the truth. She knew I was the rightful heir to the grandfather's fortune, and the insecurity was eating her alive. Before I could formulate my pathetic response, a booming voice echoed from the end of the hall. "That is absolutely enough." My managing partner, Thomas, strode across the floor. Thomas was a no-nonsense veteran of the financial industry who knew exactly how much money my audits brought into the firm. He stepped between me and Diana, his arms crossed over his chest, looking at her like she was a piece of trash on his shoe. "I do not care who you are," Lady Thomas said, his voice hard and uncompromising. "You do not barge into my firm and threaten my best senior auditor. Naomi has impeccable integrity. If you have a legal accusation, you can contact our corporate attorneys. Otherwise, you need to leave this building immediately before I have security physically throw you out onto the pavement." Diana scoffed, looking Thomas up and down with utter disgust. "You are protecting a thief," she sneered. "She is stealing from my family." Thomas pulled his cell phone from his pocket. "I am dialing security right now," he stated firmly. This was my moment. I needed to hook her back in. I needed her to leave feeling victorious, convinced that I was completely broken. "Wait, Thomas, please," I cried out, stepping out from behind him. I forced fresh tears into my eyes and let my voice crack with utter defeat. "Do not call security. She is my sister." I turned to Diana, clasping my hands together in a perfect display of submission. "Diana, I am so sorry," I sobbed loudly, ensuring everyone in the office could hear me. "I was not snooping, I swear. I am just so overwhelmed by all the legal documents Jamal wants me to sign." "But you win." "Okay, you win. Tell Jamal I will do whatever you want. I will come to the family gala on Friday night. I will stand up in front of everyone and sign the trust fund completely over to you. Just please stop yelling at me. Please leave my job out of this." Diana stared at me, her furious expression slowly melting into a smug, triumphant smirk. She looked around at my shocked coworkers, soaking in her false sense of superiority. "Friday night, Naomi," Diana said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "Wear something decent for once. If you embarrass me again, it will be the last thing you ever do." She turned on her heel and strutted out of the office, leaving me weeping into my hands. But the moment the glass doors shut behind her, my tears completely vanished. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and stood up straight. My coworkers were still staring at me, but I completely ignored them and walked right back to my cubicle. I sat down, pulled out my cell phone, and dialed Jamal's private number. It rang 3 times before he picked up. "What do you want, Naomi?" Jamal answered, his voice sharp and annoyed. I made my breathing sound ragged and uneven. "Jamal, please," I whispered. "Diana just came to my office. She screamed at me in front of my entire team. She accused me of stealing from you. You have to make her stop. I cannot lose my job. It is all I have." I heard him chuckle softly on the other end of the line. "Well, Naomi, my wife can be a bit passionate when it comes to protecting her family assets. I told you that uncooperative strays get dealt with. If you do not want your professional life destroyed, you know exactly what you need to do." "I do," I sobbed, gripping the phone tightly. "You win, Jamal. Both of you win. I cannot fight you anymore. I am exhausted. I will come to the family gala on Friday night. I will stand up on that stage in front of all your wealthy friends, and I will sign the trust fund completely over to Diana. I will sign the power of attorney. Just please leave me alone after this." There was a long pause on his end. I could practically hear his massive ego swelling. He thought his intimidation tactics had worked perfectly. He thought he had crushed the street rat back into the dirt where she belonged. "That is a very smart decision," Naomi Jamal said, his tone shifting to a sickeningly sweet purr. "We will have the documents prepared and waiting on a silver platter. You will read a prepared statement handing over the $80 million, and then you can go back to your miserable little life. But I need to be sure you are not going to back out." "I will not back out," I promised, letting a pathetic whine slip into my voice. "But I have one condition. Just one request before I sign my entire life away." Jamal sighed loudly, clearly irritated. "We are not negotiating, Naomi. You do not have the leverage to make conditions. It is not about money," I pleaded. "It is about my grandfather." "I read the legal files, Jamal. I know he left that money specifically for me. He was the only person in this entire family who actually wanted me to come home. He tried to protect me. Since I am giving up everything he wanted me to have, I just want to see his original will. I want the physical document present on the table when I sign. I just want to see his signature and know that for one brief moment, someone in this family actually cared about me." Jamal burst into a loud, cruel laugh. It was the sound of a man who possessed absolutely zero empathy. "You are unbelievable," he mocked. "You grew up bouncing around the system like discarded garbage, and you are still desperately clinging to this pathetic fantasy of a loving family. A piece of paper is not going to hug you back, Naomi. The old man is dead and his money is going to fix our problems. But if seeing his dusty old signature is what it takes to get your name on the transfer document, then fine. I will pull the original will from the estate vault and bring it to the gala. But if you stall for even 1 second on that stage, I will make sure the medical transport team hauls you away in a straitjacket right in front of the press." "I will not stall," I whispered. "Thank you, Jamal." I hung up the phone and let out a long, slow breath. My hands were perfectly steady. A cold smile spread across my face. Jamal thought he was humoring a broken woman's pathetic sentimentality. He was so blinded by his own arrogance and greed that he completely missed the massive legal trap I had just laid out for him. As a senior forensic accountant who regularly consulted with federal task forces, I knew the highly specific protocols for immediate high-level asset seizures. Because the $80 million trust fund was legally bound to the grandfather's original estate documents, the FBI and the IRS could not immediately freeze the assets and reroute the power of attorney without the original verified physical will present. If the will was locked away in a bank vault, it would take weeks for a judge to issue a subpoena. By that time, Jamal could have transferred the cartel money offshore. But by manipulating his ego and begging him to bring the physical document out of the vault to the gala, he had just bypassed months of legal hurdles for us. He was literally carrying the weapon of his own destruction right into my hands. Miles away in the opulent, dimly lit study of the Kensington mansion, Jamal tossed his cell phone onto the polished glass desk. Richard was sitting across from him, gripping a heavy crystal glass of expensive scotch with trembling hands. The stress of the cartel deadline was clearly eating away at the older man. "Well," Richard asked, his voice tight with unbearable anxiety. "What did she say? Is she going to fight us in court? Do we need to call the medical team?" Jamal smiled, pouring himself a generous drink. He walked over to the massive window overlooking the sprawling estate. He took a slow sip of his liquor and leaned back against the glass, crossing his legs with absolute undeniable triumph. "Relax," Richard Jamal said, his voice echoing with arrogant finality. The street rat just completely surrendered. She was sobbing on the phone. "She is going to sign everything over to Diana on Friday night in front of all our guests. I told you I could break her, and I did. We are getting the 80 million. We are getting the 80 million. Jamal's arrogant words echoed in the silence of his study, completely unaware that his entire empire was already bleeding out. The following morning, I took a cab to an industrial park on the outskirts of the city. I walked into a drab, windowless concrete building that looked like an abandoned warehouse from the outside. Inside, it was a state-of-the-art secure federal facility. A guard checked my identification and escorted me down a fluorescent-lit hallway into a soundproof conference room. Special Agent Miller was already waiting at the metal table. He was a tall, imposing man with a no-nonsense demeanor. Sitting next to him was an older, sharp-eyed woman who introduced herself as Special Agent Reynolds from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. They looked at me with a healthy dose of federal skepticism. To them, I was just a civilian auditor, making massive claims about a prominent billionaire family and a dangerous international drug cartel. I did not waste any time trying to convince them with words. I unzipped my cheap work bag, pulled out the encrypted USB drive, and slid it across the cold metal table. I connected my laptop to the secure projection screen mounted on the wall. "I am going to walk you through the shadow ledgers," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. Jamal Kensington is running a highly sophisticated washing cycle. He uses the family commercial real estate acquisitions as the front. The cartel cash moves from illicit accounts in Colombia into blind trusts in Panama. From there, Jamal funnels it into overvalued construction contracts here in the States. The money goes in dirty and comes out completely clean. I clicked to the next slide, highlighting a series of red numbers. "But here is the fatal flaw," I continued. Jamal got greedy. He started skimming a 5% management fee off the top of the cartel money to fund his own luxury lifestyle. The cartel found out. They are demanding an immediate $40 million repayment by this Friday. That is why the Kensington family is desperate to steal my $80 million trust fund. They are literally trying to buy their lives back. Special Agent Reynolds leaned forward, staring at the screen in absolute astonishment. She took off her glasses and looked at me. "My task forces spend years trying to untangle offshore routing networks. This complex," she said, her voice filled with genuine professional respect. "How did a single auditor bypass his network security and trace this in one night?" I looked right at her. "Growing up with absolutely nothing in the foster system teaches you to notice the tiny details everyone else ignores," I explained. "You learn to spot the lies adults tell because your daily survival depends on it." Jamal is a brilliant lawyer, but he is arrogant. He believes his wealth makes him completely untouchable. He left digital footprints everywhere because he never imagined someone like me would dare to look. The room fell completely silent. I took a deep breath and clicked to the final slide. The financial fraud was enough to put them away, but I needed the agents to understand the true depth of the evil they were dealing with. The screen shifted to the yellowed 1999 wire transfer receipt. "This is a $500,000 payment initiated by my biological father, Richard Kensington," I said, my voice dropping to a hard whisper. "It was routed to a known Eastern European human trafficking syndicate exactly 25 years ago. On the exact day I went missing. They did not lose me. They sold me. They sold their 5-year-old daughter to secure their inheritance, and now they are trying to steal the money my grandfather left to protect me." Agent Miller tightened his jaw so firmly, the muscles jumped in his cheeks. The professional curiosity in the room instantly vanished, replaced by a heavy, grim silence. This was no longer just a white-collar financial crime. It was a massive, horrific conspiracy. "Here is the plan," I said, stepping away from the screen. "Jamal is bringing my grandfather's original physical will to the family gala this Friday night. I baited him into it. With that physical document out of the vault, you have the legal jurisdiction to initiate an immediate high-level asset seizure. I need you to intercept their private security detail and replace them with undercover federal agents. I will get Jamal to confess on a hot microphone in front of hundreds of witnesses." Miller and Reynolds exchanged a long, serious look. Miller finally nodded. "We can get the warrants," Reynolds said, standing up and placing both hands firmly on the metal table. "We will set up the sting operation at the gala." But she looked me dead in the eye, her expression turning deadly serious. "Listen to me, Naomi. If you are wrong about the offshore routing numbers, if even a single decimal point is out of place, Jamal will use his corporate power to legally destroy you. He will lock you away, and we will not be able to stop him." I looked Special Agent Reynolds right in her eyes and did not blink. "I am not wrong," I said, my voice perfectly steady and cold. "I am a forensic auditor. I never miss a decimal point." I stood up, grabbed my cheap work bag, and walked out of the secure federal facility. The afternoon air felt crisp and electric. I had less than 36 hours until the gala. I just needed to go back to my apartment, rest, and mentally prepare myself for the performance of a lifetime. I took the subway home, keeping my head down and blending into the crowd exactly like I had done my entire life. But when I stepped off the elevator on my floor, I instantly knew something was horribly wrong. My front door was standing slightly ajar. The heavy steel deadbolt I meticulously locked every single morning had been violently drilled out of the frame. Metal shavings glittered on the cheap hallway carpet. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I did not call the local police. I knew the local police were likely on Jamal's payroll. I pushed the door open with my foot and stepped inside. My modest apartment had been completely destroyed. The living room looked like a war zone. The cheap fabric sofa was slashed wide open, with white synthetic stuffing scattered across the floor like fresh snow. The small glass dining table where I had sat just last night, uncovering their massive criminal empire, was shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The kitchen cabinets were thrown open, and all my plates and glasses were smashed against the cheap linoleum floor. I walked slowly down the short, narrow hallway to my bedroom. Every single dresser drawer had been pulled out and violently thrown against the wall. My closet was entirely empty. My sensible work blouses, my beige office blazers, and even my cheap winter coats had been ripped off their hangers and shredded with a pair of heavy fabric scissors. The ruined garments lay in a massive tangled pile in the center of the room. Pinned to the wall directly above my destroyed mattress was a piece of thick, expensive cream-colored stationery. It was stabbed deep into the drywall with one of my own kitchen knives. I stepped closer, pulling the knife loose, and read the elegant looping handwriting. "Do not try to run. See you tomorrow, sister." Diana. She wanted to terrify me. She wanted me to walk into this apartment, see my meager life torn to shreds, and collapse onto the floor in a puddle of hyperventilating tears. She wanted me to feel the absolute crushing weight of their wealth and power. She thought destroying my sanctuary would shatter my fragile mind. But as I stood in the middle of my ruined bedroom surrounded by the shredded remains of my wardrobe, I did not shed a single tear. I actually smiled. Growing up in the foster system, you quickly learn that physical possessions mean absolutely nothing. I had been abruptly moved from house to house in the middle of the night, with all of my worldly belongings shoved into a single black garbage bag. I had my favorite books thrown away by angry foster mothers. I learned early on that you cannot attach your self-worth to the things you own because people can always take things away. Diana thought destroying my cheap clothes would break my spirit because her entire identity was tied to her expensive designer wardrobe. She had no idea that my strength came from my mind. I walked out of the bedroom and over to the small linen closet in the hallway. I pulled out the bottom shelf and lifted a loose wooden floorboard that I used as a personal safe. They had completely missed it. Inside was a sleek black protective garment bag and a heavy fireproof lockbox containing my backup laptop. I pulled the garment bag out and carefully unzipped it. Inside was an immaculate custom-tailored charcoal gray power suit. I bought it with my very first major corporate bonus years ago and saved it for the most important days of my career. It was a piece of clothing that represented thousands of hours of studying late nights and sheer, undeniable brilliance. Diana thought I would show up to the gala in rags looking like a defeated stray. She was going to be staring at a woman dressed for absolute corporate warfare. I laid the pristine suit carefully across the only undamaged chair in the room. Then I opened the fireproof box and pulled out my laptop. I sat down on the floor right in the middle of the wreckage of my life and booted it up. I connected to the secure federal portal Special Agent Miller had established for me. I needed to make sure Jamal could not move a single penny offshore before the trap completely closed. I opened a terminal window and began writing a highly specific encrypted command script. I tied the script directly to the routing numbers of Jamal's offshore cartel accounts. The command was simple but devastating. The exact millisecond Jamal's local server received the digital signature authorizing the release of my $80 million trust fund, the script would automatically trigger a massive firewall block. It would instantly freeze every single one of his accounts, locking the cartel money completely in place. He would be holding a signed piece of paper, but his digital empire would be entirely paralyzed. I reviewed the complex code, checking every single decimal point and routing sequence. It was flawless. I hovered my finger over the enter key. "See you tomorrow, Diana," I whispered to the empty room. I pressed the key, and the encrypted command locked into the federal server, waiting silently in the dark. I zipped my garment bag and carried my lockbox out of the ruined apartment. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of the Four Seasons downtown. It was a place Diana would frequent for high tea, using money soaked in cartel blood. I was paying for my penthouse suite with funds I earned through my own relentless intelligence. The hotel staff did not blink at my lack of luggage. They simply handed me a heavy keycard. I rode the glass elevator to the top floor, looking out over the glittering city skyline. I walked into the sprawling suite, locked the heavy wooden door behind me, and immediately transformed the dining table into a forensic command center. I ordered a pot of black coffee from room service and opened my laptop. The federal sting operation was in place, but the agents could only make the arrests. I was the one who had to deliver the execution. I opened my presentation software and began building the most devastating audit report of my entire career. Slide 1. The fake corporate tax returns. Jamal filed for Kensington Holdings over the past 5 years. I color-coded the discrepancies, showing exactly how they inflated their asset valuations to secure massive fraudulent loans. Slide 2. The cartel shell companies. I imported the data from the shadow ledgers, creating a highly visual web of offshore accounts. I drew bright red lines connecting the illicit funds directly into the personal checking accounts of Richard and Jamal. I made sure the numbers were massive, bold, and absolutely undeniable. As I formatted the graphs showing millions of dollars flowing effortlessly into their pockets, my mind drifted back to the harsh reality of my childhood. While my father was routing cartel money to buy imported sports cars, I was sitting on the cold floor of a damp basement apartment, eating cheap cold ramen noodles because my foster mother locked the pantry. While Catherine was dripping in diamonds and attending exclusive country club galas, I was sitting on a concrete curb under a flickering street lamp, trying to finish my high school math homework because the state group home refused to pay the electric bill. I remembered taping the soles of my only pair of sneakers together so I could walk 3 miles to the public library in the freezing rain. I spent my weekends reading old accounting textbooks because I knew education was the only weapon I would ever have to escape the crushing cycle of poverty they abandoned me to. Every single hardship, every cold night, every pang of hunger I endured was directly funded by the $500,000 they accepted in exchange for my life. They stole my childhood so they could live like royalty. Now I was going to use the exact skills I learned in the dark to take everything they had. I poured another cup of coffee and moved to the final slide. Slide 3. The 1999 wire transfer. I enlarged the scanned receipt until his signature filled the entire screen. I highlighted the date. I highlighted the routing number linking to the human trafficking syndicate. This was the ultimate payload. This was the slide that would not just send them to federal prison, but would completely destroy their social standing, their legacy, and their entire existence in the eyes of the elite world they worshipped. I reviewed the presentation 12 times. Special Agent Reynolds had warned me that a single mistake would give Jamal the legal loophole he needed to destroy me. But there were absolutely no mistakes. The math was absolute perfection. I saved the final presentation onto a fresh encrypted drive and closed the laptop. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and watched the city sleep. The sky was still a deep, inky black, but I could see a faint purple glow creeping over the distant horizon. The hours passed in total silence. I did not sleep a single wink. I just stood there, watching the darkness slowly fade away. When the morning sun finally broke over the city skyline, casting a bright golden light across the hotel room, I turned away from the window. I walked into the marble bathroom and washed my face. I unzipped the black protective bag and pulled out my tailored charcoal gray power suit. I slipped on a pair of sensible but expensive black heels. I pulled my hair back into a tight, uncompromising style. I looked at my reflection in the massive mirror. The scared little foster girl was completely gone. The weeping victim Jamal thought he broke was gone. Staring back at me was a predator. The day of the gala had officially arrived. I grabbed my purse and the encrypted drive. The hunt begins right now. I took a private car from the hotel straight to the Kensington estate. The winding driveway was completely jammed with luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp uniforms were running back and forth, while photographers stood near the grand entrance, flashing their cameras at the arriving elite. This was not just a family gathering. This was a highly orchestrated public relations event designed to legitimize their theft of my $80 million trust fund. I stepped out of the car and walked past the flashing bulbs. The moment I entered the grand foyer, the sheer scale of their hypocrisy hit me. The massive room was filled with hundreds of the most powerful people in the city. State senators, corporate judges, and high society influencers were sipping expensive champagne and mingling under the crystal chandeliers. A string quartet played softly in the corner, adding a layer of sophisticated elegance to a room completely built on lies and cartel blood money. I spotted Diana standing near the grand staircase. She was wearing a custom silver gown dripping in diamonds, looking like a queen surveying her kingdom. When she saw me walking toward her, the smug smile on her face completely vanished. She had expected me to show up in the hideous, oversized dress from the country club, or worse, wearing the shredded remains of my wardrobe she had destroyed. She wanted me to look like a broken, defeated victim. Instead, I was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal gray power suit. My hair was pulled back sharp and severe. I did not look like a mental patient. I looked like an executive about to hostilely take over her entire life. Before Diana could even speak, Richard and Catherine intercepted me. Catherine was wearing a dramatic black velvet gown, playing the role of the elegant matriarch who had finally found peace. "Oh, my darling Naomi, you made it," Catherine cried out, throwing her arms around me for the cameras. But as she hugged me, her manicured fingers dug violently into my shoulder blade. "Smile, you little brat," she hissed directly into my ear, her voice completely drowned out by the chatter of the crowd. "Do exactly as you are told tonight, or Jamal will have you hauled out the back door in a straitjacket before anyone even notices you are gone." Richard stepped up and grabbed my upper arm. His grip was like a steel vise, immediately leaving dark bruises beneath the fabric of my suit jacket. He dragged me over to a group of wealthy politicians. "Senator, it is an absolute miracle," he declared, his voice booming with fake emotion. 25 years of relentless searching, 25 years of absolute heartbreak, and we finally have our missing daughter back. I stood there forcing a stiff, polite smile, while my biological father lied straight to the face of a state senator. He spoke about the sleepless nights and the tears they shed. He spun a beautiful, tragic fairy tale about a family torn apart by fate. Every time I tried to pull slightly away from his crushing grip, he would squeeze harder, sending sharp spikes of pain down my arm. He wanted to physically remind me that he was entirely in control. I looked into the faces of the wealthy elite nodding in sympathy. They had absolutely no idea that the man shaking their hands and drinking their toasts had accepted $500,000 from human traffickers to permanently dispose of his 5-year-old child. They did not know that the elegant woman crying delicate tears of joy had willingly dropped my hand in a public park and walked away forever to secure her wealth. They were applauding monsters. As Richard dragged me toward another group of investors, I let my eyes sweep across the perimeter of the room. Jamal thought he had hired the best private security money could buy. But I noticed that the heavily armed guards standing near the exit doors were different men than the ones from 2 days ago. I noticed a waiter carrying a tray of champagne whose posture was far too rigid for the service industry. A woman adjusting a floral arrangement near the catering entrance had an earpiece tucked discreetly beneath her hair. Special Agent Miller had delivered exactly as promised. The federal trap was completely set. The doors were effectively sealed. I caught Jamal's eye across the room. He was standing near a small, raised stage that had been set up at the far end of the grand hall. Resting on a velvet-draped podium, right in the center of the stage, was a silver tray holding a stack of thick legal documents. My trust fund transfer papers. And resting right beside them was a worn, leather-bound folder. My grandfather's original physical will. Jamal flashed me a terrifying, arrogant smile, confirming my absolute submission. He adjusted his designer tie and stepped up onto the stage. The classical music playing softly in the background suddenly faded away. Jamal reached out and tapped the microphone, sending a sharp, echoing thud through the massive room, signaling for absolute silence. It was time for the ceremony. The sharp thud of Jamal tapping the microphone echoed through the massive hall. The polite chatter of the wealthy guests instantly faded into a hush. All eyes turned toward the stage. Jamal stood behind the velvet-draped podium, looking every bit the distinguished legal scholar. He offered the crowd a warm, practiced smile that completely hid the monster, lurking beneath his expensive suit. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Jamal began, his voice projecting smoothly across the room. "We gathered this evening to celebrate a profound miracle. As many of you know, my wife Diana and her parents have carried a heavy burden of grief for 25 long years. But tonight that grief ends. Tonight our family is finally whole again." The crowd murmured with polite sympathy. Richard and Catherine stood near the front row, clutching each other and nodding with exaggerated emotion. They played the roles of the devastated but healing parents perfectly. But the journey home has not been easy. Jamal continued, lowering his voice to a tone of deep, patronizing concern. "Our beloved Naomi survived a harsh and unforgiving world. The foster system is a tragic place, and the decades she spent completely alone bouncing from one state facility to another have left deep psychological scars. She has struggled immensely with her mental health and her grip on reality. When we found her, we promised to protect her and provide the comprehensive medical care she so desperately needs." I stood near the edge of the stage, keeping my face completely blank. Jamal was painting a masterpiece of public manipulation. He was publicly establishing my supposed mental incompetence right in front of state senators and corporate judges. He was making sure that if I ever tried to speak out about the cartel money or the human trafficking, no one in this room would believe a single word I said. They would just look at me with pity and dismiss me as a delusional psychiatric patient. "Our late grandfather left a substantial trust fund," Jamal explained, gesturing to the stack of thick legal documents resting next to the worn leather will on the podium. $80 million to be exact. It is an overwhelming amount of money and an immense financial responsibility for someone who is actively battling severe psychological trauma. But Naomi is incredibly brave. She recognizes her current limitations. Tonight she has made the selfless, mature decision to step away from the stress of this financial burden. She is voluntarily signing the entire trust over to her sister Diana, who will manage the estate and ensure Naomi is taken care of for the rest of her life. The crowd let out a collective sigh of admiration. They thought they were witnessing a beautiful act of family devotion and healing. They had absolutely no idea they were watching a high-stakes hostage situation unfolding in real time. Jamal extended his hand toward me, his eyes locking onto mine. "Please welcome my brave sister-in-law Naomi to the stage," he announced. The guests broke into enthusiastic applause. Diana immediately appeared at my side. She grabbed my upper arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging painfully through the fabric of my suit jacket. She leaned in close as she walked me up the short flight of stairs to the stage, keeping her bright fake smile plastered on her face for the photographers. "Smile for the cameras, you pathetic little street rat," Diana whispered directly into my ear, her voice completely drowned out by the clapping audience. "Walk up to that podium and sign the document. If you hesitate for even 1 second, I will signal the transport team waiting outside. You will be strapped to a gurney and locked inside a padded straitjacket by midnight. You are entirely out of options." I let her guide me to the center of the stage. The heat of the overhead spotlights hit my face. I looked out at the sea of wealthy, powerful people, completely mesmerized by Jamal's elegant lies. Then I looked down at the podium. Resting right next to the fraudulent transfer agreement was the worn leather folder containing my grandfather's original will. I could see his faded signature on the heavy parchment paper. He had signed that document, hoping it would protect me from the wolves in his own house. He had left that money as a shield against the exact monsters standing right next to me. Jamal picked up a heavy gold fountain pen from the silver tray. He held it out to me, his eyes flashing with dark, terrifying victory. He thought he had completely won. He thought the cartel debt was solved, and his lavish, corrupt lifestyle was secure for decades to come. "Sign right here on the dotted line, Naomi." Jamal said, his voice practically purring with satisfaction. The audience continued to clap politely, waiting for the heartwarming conclusion to the family tragedy. I reached out and took the gold pen from his hand. The metal felt heavy and cold against my skin. I looked at the pen. Then I looked at Jamal. Then I looked at Diana, who was standing just a few feet away, with a smug, expectant smirk on her face. I did not lower the pen to the paper. Instead, I gripped the expensive gold barrel with both hands. I applied a sudden burst of pressure, snapping the solid metal completely in half. Black ink exploded over my fingers and dripped onto the pristine velvet podium. The polite applause in the room instantly died. The polite applause in the room instantly died. The only sound was the heavy dripping of black ink falling from my hands onto the velvet fabric of the podium. Jamal stared at the two broken halves of the solid gold pen resting in my palms. His brain could not compute what had just happened. For a man who controlled everything, the sight of raw physical defiance completely short-circuited his arrogant mind. Diana let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She took a step toward me, her hands reaching out like claws. "What are you doing?" she hissed under her breath, her fake smile cracking into a mask of pure panic. "I told you to sign it." I dropped the broken pieces of the pen onto the silver tray. They landed with a loud metallic clatter that echoed through the dead silent hall. I did not look at Diana. I did not look at my parents, who were now frozen in their front row seats. I stepped right past Jamal, brushing my shoulder against his expensive suit, and grabbed the microphone directly from the stand. I turned to face the hundreds of wealthy guests. I did not look down. I did not cower. I stood tall in my custom-tailored suit and offered the crowd a brilliant, radiant smile. "Jamal is absolutely right," I said, my voice booming clearly across the massive room. "I am an accountant, and as any good financial professional in this room will tell you, we never sign anything without conducting a thorough audit first." A wave of confused murmurs swept through the audience. Harrison, the senior investment banker from the country club brunch, was sitting in the third row. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with intense curiosity. He knew exactly how sharp I was, and he sensed that the narrative Jamal had just spun was about to violently unravel. For the past 25 years, my family has carefully managed their public image. I continued, my voice steady and commanding. They have presented themselves as pillars of the community, titans of real estate. And tonight, they tried to present themselves as the tragic heroes of a heartbreaking family reunion. But an auditor does not look at the public image. An auditor looks at the raw data, and the data tells a very different story. I slipped my ink-stained hand into the pocket of my suit jacket. My fingers wrapped around the small plastic remote I had concealed there since I left the hotel. Behind the podium, a massive digital screen had been projecting a beautiful high-resolution portrait of the Kensington family. It was a picture-perfect lie. I pressed the button on my remote. The family portrait vanished instantly. The massive screen went pitch black for a fraction of a second before flashing back to life. A collective gasp echoed through the grand hall. Instead of smiling faces, the screen was now displaying a live, highly detailed forensic financial ledger. It was the exact presentation I had built in my hotel room. Massive red columns dominated the display, showing catastrophic corporate losses. Bright neon lines traced pathways from the Kensington Holdings main accounts directly into a web of highly encrypted offshore shell companies. I had color-coded every single fraudulent transaction, making it so simple to read that even a first-year business student could understand the magnitude of the crime. The room erupted into chaotic whispers. The state senators and corporate judges in the audience immediately recognized the format of a federal financial investigation. They began pointing at the screen, reading the names of the dummy corporations Jamal had set up to hide his tracks. I looked out at the sea of shocked faces. This was the culmination of my entire life. All those years I spent studying in freezing foster homes, all those nights I ate cheap noodles while reading tax laws, were for this exact moment. They thought my past made me a fragile victim they could easily manipulate. But my past had actually forged me into the exact weapon needed to dismantle their empire. Jamal finally snapped out of his paralyzed shock. He turned around and looked at the massive screen towering behind him. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He saw the exact routing numbers he thought were safely hidden behind military-grade encryption, now broadcasted to the most powerful people in the city. "Turn it off!" Jamal screamed, his voice cracking with absolute terror. He lunged toward the podium, frantically searching for a cable to rip out or a switch to flip. "Turn that screen off right now." I took a step back, keeping a firm grip on the microphone. I did not let him silence me. "Before we talk about my mental health," I announced, my voice slicing through his panicked screaming like a knife. "Let us talk about the $12 million Jamal wired to the Sinaloa cartel last Tuesday." The word cartel dropped like a bomb in the middle of the elegant room. The state senators, who had just been shaking Richard's hand, physically recoiled. Women in expensive gowns gasped aloud and covered their mouths. Jamal froze completely, his panicked screaming caught entirely in his throat. I did not give him a single second to recover. I pressed the button on my remote, and the screen behind me shifted to a brand new slide. "Here is the primary dummy corporation registered in the Cayman Islands," I announced, pointing at a massive organizational chart that filled the massive digital display. "And here are the routing numbers moving illicit drug money directly into Kensington Holdings." Jamal thought he was a genius, using the family real estate portfolio to wash dirty cash, but he was incredibly sloppy. I clicked the remote again. The screen zoomed in on a series of heavily redacted commercial real estate contracts. I pressed another button and my software stripped away the black redactions, revealing Jamal's distinct signature on every single page. He forged these documents to authorize the massive cash transfers, completely bypassing federal banking oversight. Diana stared up at the screen, her mouth hanging open in absolute shock. The heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone suddenly looked like a cheap leash. She turned to her husband, demanding an explanation, but Jamal was hyperventilating. His eyes were darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit. He knew his legal career, his freedom, and his very life were entirely over. But the cartel money laundering operation was only half of the story. I turned my attention away from the glowing screen and pointed directly at my biological parents, who were cowering in the front row. Richard's face had turned an unhealthy shade of purple, and Catherine was trembling so violently she had to grip the back of the chair in front of her just to stay standing. "They did not bring me here tonight out of love," I told the crowd, my voice ringing with absolute unwavering authority. "They brought me here out of pure, unadulterated desperation." I clicked to the next slide, exposing the family's true financial reality. A massive red graph plummeted toward the bottom of the screen. "Kensington Holdings is completely bankrupt," I declared, letting the truth echo off the high ceilings. Richard made a series of catastrophic commercial investments over the last decade and leveraged everything they own to the absolute limit. They are drowning in debt, and they have absolutely nothing left. But Jamal got greedy. He started skimming millions off the top of the cartel money to keep up their lavish country club lifestyle. The wealthy guests began murmuring in sheer disgust. The grand illusion of the untouchable Kensington dynasty was shattering right in front of their eyes. Harrison, the senior investment banker, stood up from his chair, his face pale with fury, realizing he had almost done business with a cartel front. The cartel found out about the stolen money. I continued, letting my words sink deep into the silence of the room. They demanded an immediate $40 million repayment. If Richard and Jamal did not pay by this Friday, the cartel was going to start eliminating the family one by one. That is why they suddenly cared so much about finding their missing daughter. They needed my $80 million trust fund tonight because they are bankrupt, and the cartel is coming to collect. They were willing to forge psychiatric evaluations and lock me inside a medical facility just to steal my inheritance and save their own miserable lives. The room erupted into absolute, uncontrollable chaos. Guests began shouting and pushing toward the heavy wooden doors, desperate to distance themselves from a family actively targeted by a violent international drug syndicate. Investors pulled out their cell phones, frantically dialing their corporate lawyers to sever all financial ties with Kensington Holdings. The elegant gala had turned into a nightmare of their own making. Richard jumped up from his seat, his face contorted with absolute terrified rage. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me. "She is lying," he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "She is a delusional, psychotic liar. We have the medical evaluations to prove it. Security!" He spun around, frantically waving his arms at the heavily armed private guards stationed around the perimeter of the grand hall. "Security, get her off that stage right now!" Richard bellowed, his face red with exertion. "Arrest her for corporate espionage and theft!" Jamal joined in his panic, turning into vicious, desperate aggression. "Grab her!" Jamal yelled, pointing at the stage. "Take her down immediately!" I stood perfectly still behind the velvet podium, gripping the microphone with quiet confidence. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I just watched them scream. The heavily armed guards standing by the exit doors did not move a single muscle. The waiter holding the champagne tray slowly placed it on a nearby table. The woman adjusting the floral arrangement calmly reached beneath her blazer. Richard screamed for them again, demanding they follow his orders and remove me from the stage. But the private security guards just stood there, their eyes locked entirely on me, awaiting my command. They were not his private security anymore. The heavily armed guards standing by the exit doors did not move a single muscle. The waiter holding the champagne tray slowly placed it on a nearby table. The woman adjusting the floral arrangement calmly reached beneath her blazer. Richard screamed for them again, demanding they follow his orders and remove me from the stage. But the private security guards just stood there, their eyes locked entirely on me, awaiting my command. They were not his private security anymore. Diana finally snapped. The realization that her entire life of luxury was crashing down around her broke through her polished facade. She lunged across the stage, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. She raised her hand, aiming a vicious slap directly at my face, intending to physically knock me away from the microphone and the podium. I did not even flinch. I reached up and caught her wrist in midair. My grip was like iron fueled by 25 years of survival. She gasped, struggling to pull her arm back, but I held her firmly in place. "You think I am crazy, Diana?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly calm whisper. "Let us look at one last document." I shoved her arm away, sending her stumbling backward in her silver gown. I pressed the button on my remote for the final time. The massive screen behind us shifted from the red lines of the cartel money laundering operation to a single yellowed piece of paper. It was a high-resolution scan of a banking receipt. "I want everyone in this room to look very closely at the date on this transfer," I said, projecting my voice to the farthest corners of the grand hall. October 14, 1999. The day police reports claimed I wandered away from a family picnic and vanished. The room fell into a suffocating, absolute silence. Even Jamal stopped hyperventilating, staring up at the screen with wide, uncomprehending eyes. "Now look at the amount," I instructed, pacing slowly across the stage. $500,000, transferred from a private offshore account, registered to my father. And finally look at the recipient routing number. I clicked the remote, highlighting the recipient string in bright red. "That routing number belongs to an Eastern European holding company," I explained, my voice steady, despite the massive weight of the truth. "But they did not trade in stocks or real estate. They were a violent international human trafficking syndicate." A woman in the second row let out a sharp, horrified gasp. "I was not kidnapped by strangers," I declared, looking directly down at Richard and Catherine, who were now shrinking back into their chairs. "I did not get lost in the woods. My parents did not spend 25 years searching for me. They sold me. They handed their daughter over to human traffickers for $500,000 because my grandfather was about to change his will. They threw me away to secure the fortune for Diana." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The room erupted into screams of absolute horror and disgust. The wealthy elite who had just been applauding Richard and Catherine a few minutes ago now looked at them like they were covered in a deadly plague. The socialites sitting next to them physically scrambled out of their chairs, knocking over crystal glasses and champagne flutes to get away. They backed away from my parents, as if they were diseased, leaving Richard and Catherine entirely isolated in the center of the room. Catherine covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, but no one rushed to comfort her. Richard looked wildly around the room, his face pale and slick with sweat, trying to find a single friendly face, but he only found sheer revulsion. Even Diana looked down at her parents with a completely shattered expression, finally realizing the true monstrous cost of her golden childhood. They sold their own child to buy luxury cars and country club memberships, I said, my voice echoing above the chaos. And tonight they tried to steal the trust fund my grandfather left me by forcing me to sign it away under the threat of permanent institutionalization. They thought I was just a disposable piece of trash they could throw away a second time. Before Richard could open his mouth to scream another lie, a new sound pierced through the heavy oak doors of the grand hall. It started as a faint wail in the distance, but rapidly grew into a deafening chorus. Sirens. Dozens of police sirens were approaching the estate from every single direction, cutting through the quiet suburban night. Red and blue lights began flashing furiously through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the shocked faces of the audience in harsh, shifting colors. Red and blue lights began flashing furiously through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the shocked faces of the audience in harsh, shifting colors. The wailing of the sirens outside grew deafening, cutting through the panicked screams of the elite guests trapped inside the grand hall. Jamal staggered backward away from the podium, his eyes wide with animalistic terror. He looked at the flashing lights, and then looked at the worn leather folder resting on the velvet stand right next to my hand. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He finally understood why I had begged him to bring the physical document out of the vault. I did not want to say goodbye to my grandfather. I needed the original physical will present in the room to authorize a total and immediate federal asset seizure. You set us up! Jamal choked out his voice, barely audible over the chaos, his chest heaving as panic completely consumed him. I did not just set you up, Jamal, I replied, picking up the heavy leather folder and holding it safely against my chest. I completely dismantled you. But before your new friends in the federal government come through those doors, I have one final piece of business to clarify with my family. I pressed the remote one last time. The screen behind me shifted from the 1999 wire transfer receipt to a high-resolution scan of the exact document I was holding in my arms. It was my grandfather's original unredacted will and testament. Jamal told you all that my grandfather left me an $80 million trust fund, I announced, projecting my voice so loudly it echoed above the wailing sirens outside. He told you I was going to sign it over to Diana tonight. But Jamal never actually read the unredacted version of the will. My grandfather kept the true master copy hidden with a private legal firm that Jamal could not access. I found it during my audit. Richard stopped staring at the flashing police lights and whipped his head around to look at the screen. His jaw dropped. Catherine let out a pathetic whimper, clutching her husband's arm as the dense legal jargon illuminated the room. Harrison, the senior investment banker, pointed at the screen, reading the clauses aloud to the other stunned executives. My grandfather knew exactly what you did, Richard, I said, staring directly down into his terrified eyes. He knew you sold me to that syndicate. He could not prove it to the police without risking my life, but he made absolutely sure you would never truly win. He wrote a fail-safe clause into the foundation of the Kensington Empire. I pointed to the highlighted legal text glowing brightly on the massive digital display. The clause states that if I was ever found alive and legally verified by a DNA match, the $80 million trust fund would immediately unlock, I explained. But that was not all. The moment my identity was confirmed, the entirety of the Kensington corporate holdings, the real estate portfolio, the liquid assets, and this very mansion would immediately transfer to my sole legal control. Diana let out a blood-curdling scream, dropping to her knees in her ruined designer gown. No, she wailed, clutching her head, shaking violently. That is mine. That is all mine. You cannot take my life. You have absolutely nothing, Diana. I said, my voice raining down on her like ice. My grandfather legally stripped Richard, Catherine, and Diana of every single penny they ever claimed to own. You are entirely disinherited. You do not own the cars you drove here in. You do not own the jewelry around your neck. You are penniless. And because I am now the sole controlling shareholder of Kensington Holdings, the federal government can freeze every single asset without you being able to contest it in court. You cannot afford a lawyer, Jamal. You cannot pay back the cartel. Your digital accounts were frozen by an IRS command script exactly 10 minutes ago. Jamal fell to his knees, his expensive suit crumpling around him. He put his hands over his face, realizing he was trapped between a lifetime in federal prison and a cartel death sentence. He had no money, no leverage, and nowhere left to run. Richard clutched his chest, his face turning ashen as his entire legacy evaporated into thin air. He had traded his 5-year-old daughter for a fortune that he never actually owned. The undercover federal agents, who had been posing as waiters and security guards, suddenly drew their concealed weapons, securing the perimeter and blocking all escape routes. The heavy oak doors at the back of the grand hall suddenly exploded open with a deafening crash. The guests screamed and threw themselves to the floor as dozens of federal agents poured into the room wearing heavy tactical gear. Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Reynolds led the charge, their weapons drawn and aimed directly at the front of the room. The red laser sights of their firearms cut through the smoky air, landing squarely on Jamal and Richard. FBI, nobody move! Miller roared, his voice booming over the chaos. Jamal Kensington. Richard Kensington, get on the ground right now. Show me your hands. Jamal did not drop to the ground. Pure animal panic took over his brilliant legal mind. He spun around, slipping slightly against the polished marble floor, and made a desperate sprint toward the catering kitchen exit. He shoved a screaming socialite out of his way, sending her crashing into a table of crystal glasses. He thought his wealth would make him fast enough to escape federal custody. He was wrong. The undercover agent who had been posing as a waiter holding the champagne tray seamlessly stepped directly into his path. The agent simply lowered his shoulder and tackled Jamal with the devastating force of a freight train. They hit the floor with a sickening thud. Before Jamal could even gasp for air, the agent had his knee planted firmly between his shoulder blades. The sharp metallic click of heavy handcuffs locking around Jamal's wrists echoed loudly, sealing the fate of the man who thought he was untouchable. Richard watched his son-in-law get slammed to the floor and instantly realized running was impossible. So he resorted to complete and utter manipulation. Richard stumbled backward, clutching the left side of his chest with both hands. His face twisted into an exaggerated mask of sheer agony. He let out a loud, dramatic wheeze and collapsed heavily into one of the velvet dining chairs. "My heart!" Richard gasped, his eyes rolling back. "I cannot breathe. Call an ambulance." Catherine threw herself over him, shrieking loudly. "Help him!" she wailed. "Get a doctor right now!" Two paramedics wearing bright yellow emergency vests pushed through the oak doors carrying a medical stretcher. They rushed over to Richard, who let his eyes flutter shut, playing the frail dying patriarch to absolute perfection. He thought he was going to be safely transported to a private hospital where his lawyers could arrange a flight out of the country. The paramedics lifted Richard onto the stretcher. But instead of strapping an oxygen mask over his face, one paramedic forcefully grabbed Richard's right wrist. The metallic click of a handcuff snapped loudly, locking his arm directly to the thick metal rail of the medical bed. The other paramedic locked his left wrist to the opposite side. "Your heart rate is completely steady, Mr. Kensington," the paramedic stated, his voice devoid of sympathy. He pulled back his yellow vest, revealing a federal badge. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering and human trafficking." Richard's eyes snapped open, the fake heart attack instantly vanishing, but he was securely chained. As they wheeled him away, Catherine realized her husband and Jamal were gone. She immediately changed her strategy. She dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She looked up at Special Agent Reynolds and clasped her hands in desperate prayer. "I did not know anything," Catherine cried, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. "I swear I had no idea what Richard and Jamal were doing. I am just a mother. They lied to me. Please, you have to believe me." I calmly walked down the stairs from the stage carrying a thick, black folder. I walked right up to Special Agent Reynolds and handed the dossier directly to her. "My mother always loved playing the helpless victim," I told the agent, keeping my eyes locked on Catherine. "She spent 25 years pretending she did not know where her daughter was. But she was never helpless. Catherine liked to keep her hands clean of the physical dirt, but she was always the one managing the books." "Open the folder, Agent Reynolds," I said. "You will find that Catherine personally signed off on every single forged cartel wire transfer. She used her maiden name to register the offshore shell companies. She was the chief financial architect of their entire criminal enterprise." Catherine stopped crying the very second the words left my mouth. Her expression shifted from a weeping mother to a cold, calculating monster. She glared at me with pure venom. Special Agent Reynolds grabbed Catherine by the arm, hauled her to her feet, and clamped the heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists, dragging her toward the exit doors. The grand hall was left in a state of absolute stunned silence. The wealthy elite guests stood frozen, watching the Kensington dynasty get dismantled, and right in the absolute center of the massive, opulent room stood Diana. She was completely alone, shivering violently in her custom silver gown. She had no husband to protect her. She had no parents to fund her. Her fake wealth was gone, and the reality of her new penniless existence was finally setting in. She looked around the room, desperate for a single sympathetic face among the crowd of elite socialites, but everyone turned their backs on her. Diana slowly turned her head toward the stage where I was standing. The arrogant expression she had worn her entire life was completely gone, erased by the crushing weight of her new reality. Her styled hair was disheveled, and her expensive makeup was running down her face in messy streaks. She took a hesitant step toward me, her silver heels clicking weakly. Then her legs simply gave out. She dropped heavily to her knees in the middle of the grand hall. She did not care that her custom gown was pooling on the marble floor. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with desperate terror. She raised her trembling hands, pressing her palms together as if praying. "Naomi, please," Diana sobbed. "Please, you cannot do this." Jamal handled all the money. I did not know about the cartel. I did not know about the human trafficking. I swear I did not know. You cannot take my house. You cannot leave me with absolutely nothing. We are sisters. We share the same blood. Please, Naomi, I have nothing. I walked down the steps and approached her. The crowd of wealthy guests parted, giving me a clear path to the weeping golden child. I stopped just a few feet away, looking down at her kneeling figure. I felt absolutely no pity. "We share nothing, Diana," I said, my voice perfectly level. "You knew exactly how Jamal funded your lavish lifestyle. You happily spent millions of dollars of cartel blood money on designer clothes, luxury vacations, and country club memberships. You actively tried to have me locked inside a psychiatric ward yesterday so you could steal my inheritance. Do not dare invoke the word sister now just because you are terrified." Diana let out a ragged gasp, burying her face in her hands. She wept loudly, hoping her dramatic display of misery would finally crack my resolve. "You say you have nothing now," I continued, stepping closer, forcing her to look up. "You had everything for 25 years. You had a massive mansion, a private education, and parents who worshipped the ground you walked on. You slept in a warm bed while I bounced between 4 abusive foster homes. I wore hand-me-downs and ate surplus food while you drank champagne on private yachts. You lived a fairy tale built on my stolen life." I crouched down so I was exactly at her eye level. I lowered my voice so only she could hear the absolute finality in my words. "Enjoy the streets, Diana," I whispered. "And by the way, I strongly advise against trying to book a hotel room tonight. I had the federal agents freeze every single one of your personal credit cards exactly 10 minutes ago." Her eyes widened in sheer horror. Before she could open her mouth to scream, Special Agent Miller stepped up right behind her. He did not offer a hand to help her up. He simply grabbed her roughly by the arm and hauled her to her feet. Diana Kensington Miller stated, his deep voice ringing with absolute federal authority. "You are under arrest for accessory to corporate fraud conspiracy to commit money laundering and possession of stolen assets. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Miller swiftly pulled her arms behind her back and clamped the heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. Diana began to thrash and wail, kicking her silver heels against the marble floor, but the seasoned agent easily overpowered her. He marched her straight toward the heavy oak exit doors, her desperate screams echoing off the ceilings of the mansion she used to rule. I followed them, walking slowly out the front doors and stepping onto the stone portico. The cool night air hit my face, carrying the sharp scent of the impending storm. The expansive circular driveway was completely flooded with flashing red and blue lights from dozens of federal vehicles and local police cruisers. I stood on the top step watching the spectacular finale of the Kensington dynasty. I watched the paramedics load Richard into the back of an ambulance flanked by armed guards. I watched Catherine weeping hysterically as she was shoved into the back of an unmarked black federal SUV. I watched Jamal fiercely resisting as 3 agents pinned him against the hood of a cruiser before throwing him inside. And finally, I watched Diana, stripped of her fake wealth and golden status, sobbing uncontrollably as the heavy metal door of a police cruiser slammed shut, sealing her fate. I stood watching the caravan of flashing lights pull out of the estate gates, driving off into the dark city. My heart was not racing. My hands were not shaking. After 25 long years, my face was perfectly calm. 6 months later, the crisp autumn wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and fresh beginnings. I stepped out of the back of a sleek black luxury SUV, letting my expensive leather heels click firmly against the paved driveway. I was wearing a brand new custom-tailored navy blue power suit, holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee in my left hand. I looked up at the towering stone facade of the Kensington estate. The sprawling manicured lawns that used to host elite garden parties were now heavily overgrown and wild. Staked right into the center of the dead brown grass, near the towering wrought iron front gates, was a massive red and white wooden sign that read, "Foreclosed" in bold capital letters. The federal prosecutors did not offer a single plea deal to any of them. The evidence I provided on that encrypted drive was so overwhelming, so meticulously organized, and entirely undeniable that the criminal trial barely lasted 3 weeks. Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Reynolds testified, presenting my forensic audit report directly to the jury. Jamal was convicted on 32 separate counts of international money laundering, wire fraud, and racketeering. The federal judge showed absolutely no mercy, sentencing him to 45 years in a maximum security penitentiary. His arrogant corporate smirk was completely wiped from his face when the heavy chains were secured around his waist, and the bailiff escorted him out of the courtroom in a bright orange jumpsuit. Richard and Catherine did not fare any better. The human trafficking charges stemming from that 1999 wire transfer, combined with the massive corporate tax fraud, earned them each 30 years, without the possibility of parole. My biological parents will spend the rest of their natural lives behind cold steel bars, stripped of their fake titles, their exclusive country club memberships, and their false dignity. They traded their absolute freedom for a fortune they never even truly owned. And then there was Diana. Because she did not actively sign the cartel wire transfers, she managed to avoid federal prison time. But she lost absolutely everything else. The government seized all her physical assets, her luxury cars, her massive designer wardrobe, her diamond jewelry, and her hidden offshore bank accounts to pay off the monumental mountains of debt Jamal left behind. Today, the former golden child of the Kensington dynasty is working a minimum wage retail job at a discount department store on the extreme outskirts of the city. She spends her grueling shifts folding cheap synthetic clothes and dealing with angry bargain shoppers while drowning in millions of dollars of unpayable legal fees. She has no wealthy friends left to save her. The high society elite she once ruled completely blacklisted her the exact moment the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. She is living the exact impoverished nightmare she used to mock me for. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee as a silver sedan pulled up the long, winding driveway, parking right behind my SUV. A sharply dressed real estate agent stepped out rapidly, adjusting his tie and carrying a thick leather briefcase. He looked nervously at the towering, gloomy mansion and then looked at me, offering a highly respectful and eager smile. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew exactly how much power I now wielded in this city. "Miss Kensington," he greeted me quickly, extending his hand. "It is an absolute honor and a pleasure to finally meet you in person. I have the final transfer documents completely prepared for your review." He paused, looking up at the massive dark windows of the empty stone fortress. "Are you absolutely certain you want to purchase this specific property as is? It carries quite a bit of dark history and negative press." I shook his hand, my grip firm and uncompromising. "The history of this house was rewritten 6 months ago," I told him, my voice steady and confident. I walked over to the hood of his silver sedan, where he hastily spread out the heavy stack of legal paperwork. I did not need to ask the bank for a commercial loan. I did not need to negotiate a 30-year mortgage rate. I simply pulled a sleek silver fountain pen from the inside pocket of my suit jacket. Using just a tiny fraction of the $80 million trust fund my grandfather deliberately left to protect me, I signed my name on the final dotted line. I bought the entire estate outright in clean, untraceable cash. The realtor meticulously stamped the documents, officially handing me the heavy brass keys to the front doors. I slipped the keys into my pocket, turning my attention back to the massive stone house. I slipped the keys into my pocket, turning my attention back to the massive stone house. I walked up the wide stone steps and pushed the heavy oak doors open. The grand foyer, which used to echo with the polite, forced laughter of the city elite, was now completely silent and empty. The crystal chandeliers still hung from the vaulted ceilings, but the expensive artwork and antique furniture had all been seized and auctioned off by federal authorities. The house was a hollow shell, exactly like the people who used to live inside it. I walked slowly down the long carpeted hallway where Jamal had once trapped me and threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward. My footsteps echoed loudly in the empty space. I felt absolutely no fear walking these halls today. I pushed open the double doors leading into the massive formal dining room. This was the exact room where I had been served my first hostile dinner. This was where Jamal had mocked my career, where Catherine had criticized my teeth, and where Richard had slid that fraudulent power of attorney document across the polished mahogany table. The table was gone now, but I could still picture them sitting there dripping in arrogance and stolen wealth. Heavy boots sounded against the hardwood floor behind me. A burly man wearing a neon yellow vest and a white hard hat walked into the dining room holding a thick roll of architectural blueprints. He was the head contractor for one of the premier commercial renovation firms in the state. "Good morning, Miss Kensington," he said, unrolling the blueprints across a folding table he had set up in the corner. "We have the crew waiting outside. We are ready to begin the demolition whenever you give the word. I just need you to confirm the structural changes for the first floor." I walked over to the blueprints. I traced my finger over the lines indicating the formal dining room, the grand study, and the lavish guest quarters. "Tear all of these walls down," I instructed him, my voice steady and resolute. "I want this entire floor opened up. We need maximum natural light for the classrooms and the communal dining hall. Tear out the imported marble floors and replace them with something warm and durable." The contractor nodded, making quick notes with a thick black marker. "And the master suite upstairs?" he asked. "Gut it completely," I replied without hesitation. "Convert it into a state-of-the-art computer lab and library, and take the backyard, the one with the heated pool and the manicured lawn, and transform it into a massive playground and community garden." I was not moving into this mansion. I had absolutely no desire to live inside a monument built on greed, manipulation, and human suffering. Instead, I was turning the Kensington estate into a comprehensive transition center and private academy for older foster children. The kids who were aging out of the system, the ones who were deemed unadoptable and thrown onto the streets with nothing but their trauma. They were going to come here. They were going to sleep in warm, safe beds, learn financial literacy, and receive the elite education that Richard and Catherine thought only belonged to the wealthy. I looked around the empty dining room one last time. Growing up, I was constantly told by the system that I was a burden. My biological family proved that they viewed me as nothing more than a disposable asset to be sold for cash. But standing here today, I realized that the worst thing they ever did to me actually gave me the power to save hundreds of kids who felt exactly like I once did. I was taking their towering symbol of classist elitism and turning it into my ultimate legacy of survival. The Kensington name would no longer be associated with cartel money and corporate fraud. It would be associated with the very street rats Jamal and Diana so deeply despised. The contractor tipped his hard hat and walked out to the front lawn to signal the demolition crews. I heard the heavy diesel engines of the bulldozers roaring to life outside. The physical destruction of their empire was officially beginning. I turned away from the blueprints and looked directly forward, making eye contact with you. Sometimes blood does not make you family, it just makes you a target. I spent my entire life wondering what was wrong with me, wondering why I was not enough for the people who brought me into this world. But the truth is, they were never enough for me. I audited my family, and their ledger came up entirely empty. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace? How did you find the strength to walk away? Let me know your stories in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that the best revenge is simply a life incredibly well lived. And remember, never let anyone tell you your worth, calculate it yourself. The most profound lesson to draw from Naomi's harrowing journey is that your inherent worth is never defined by the people who share your bloodline, nor is it determined by the trauma of your past. Society frequently pushes the narrative that family is an unbreakable bond, suggesting we owe our biological relatives infinite loyalty and forgiveness. However, Naomi's story serves as a stark, empowering reminder that toxic people are still toxic, even if they are your family. For 25 years, Naomi's biological parents and sister treated her not as a human being, but as a disposable financial asset. They sold her for their own comfort and later tried to institutionalize her to steal her rightful inheritance. If Naomi had allowed their cruelty and rejection to dictate her self-esteem, she would have remained a permanent victim. Instead, she used the extreme hardship of her foster care upbringing as a forge. Every cold night and hungry evening taught her resilience, resourcefulness, and the undeniable power of education. She literally and figuratively audited her own life, calculating her immense value when her family tried to reduce her to zero. This teaches us a universal truth: you are the sole architect of your identity. When you find yourself in environments where your value is dismissed, mocked, or exploited, you hold the power to walk away and build your own empire. Surviving a manipulative environment gives you a unique razor-sharp strength that those who are handed easy, corrupt lives will never possess. True family is built on mutual respect, safety, and genuine love, not just shared DNA. Take a hard look at the relationships in your life today and fiercely cut ties with anyone who drains your peace or manipulates your worth.